Great. So let me get started. This lecture is really based on my own work in the Austrian school and also trying to extend it. And since I am one of the odd people in the Austrian school that are not actually in economics proper or the economics discipline, but rather in an entrepreneurship department in the university, obviously I focus a lot of my research on entrepreneurship rather than the economy in the way that economists do. And I have found that to be very liberating and actually quite effective in making not only Austrian ideas known to other people and publishing on Austrian ideas in actual academic journals, because the business school disciplines are wide open for Austrian ideas, whereas economics journals are typically very closed. It's also the case that because of my entrepreneurship perspective, I think that I have a slightly different understanding for the Austrian school and the actual impact of entrepreneurship in the market process. So as Annette mentioned, I have written several books on entrepreneurship and evolutionary economics, which is a book in which I am sort of adding entrepreneurship to evolutionary economics. But what I'm really doing in the book is attacking evolutionary economics for not being evolutionary. So evolutionary economics is sort of mainstream economists taking the mainstream idea and then adding a little Schumpeter on top. So they add innovation, and therefore they get a growth theory of economic growth, in which they explain all economic growth based on technological inventions. This is in itself is a misunderstanding of Schumpeter, but it also means that the state has a potentially big role to play in investing in technologies and inventions and science, so that they therefore can generate economic growth. But this is exactly backwards, because an Austrian will understand, as I argue in the book, that, and I'll get to that in a minute, that entrepreneurs, they might develop new technologies as a means to achieve the end they already have in mind. And what really drives the market process is value and not technologies and whatever else. There are plenty of technologies that are completely worthless. So inventing worthless technologies does not improve our prosperity or well-being, which should be obvious, but there are plenty of economists who think in this way. So let's get started with this. I'm going to use my entrepreneurship perspective and, of course, the Austrian perspective to give you an idea of just how costly regulations are. And I'll end with a discussion on where the EU and Europe fit in this picture, and how we should understand what the European Union is doing to us, in a sense. So this is what I talked about, how economists in general perceive the economy. And it is totally backwards, right? It is something is created and therefore economic growth is generated as a result. But this is really, as the saying goes, placing the cart before the horse. But the horse should be dragging the cart, right? It should be leading the way, and the cart should be afterwards. You can't really have a horse pushing the cart this way. So it's completely backwards. The logic is reversed in their theories, because they focus so much on the static system and statistics and so forth. And you can't really do that and get a good idea of how the economy actually works. That is sort of a basic conclusion of understanding the Austrian school. So the way I usually put it is this very simple inequality, where cost is less than price is less than value, or value is greater than price is greater than cost. The problem here arises because in production, and how many businesses are started, how many entrepreneurs actually fail as entrepreneurs, is that they think about it as a sequence, that where one thing happens before the next, and then you just continue step by step. Obviously, when you start a business, you have costs first, because you need a maybe a facility, you need to hire people, you need to sign contracts with suppliers, you need to buy stuff, you need to sign a lease for your store, whatever it might be. So all of those things are costs, but you haven't created anything of value just yet. So a lot of entrepreneurs are fooled by this into believing that what they should do is take the costs and then add their markup percentage to the cost, which makes the price. So if my cost is, say, 80 euros per product that I produce, and I want 25% profit, then I'll just set the price to 100, and then I go out and sell it. Well, that should sort of guarantee that I make 25% profits, except that this is completely opposite of how entrepreneurs should think about it, and actually how successful entrepreneurs do think about it. Unfortunately, this is how it's taught in many programs, and I know in here in the United States that many MBA programs teach cost plus, as it's called, or markup pricing as an actual model for businesses to use, where they calculate the cost and they add the profit, and then that is the price, which completely misconstrues and misunderstands the marketplace, because what really drives everything is the value of what is being produced. So the way to think about it when you're starting a business is that, well, I want to create this thing. Maybe I'm good at producing whatever it might be, bagels, say. Then who can I sell bagels to? Who would benefit a lot from my bagels, the type of bagels that I'm really good at making? And then how can I make sure that it's of as great value as possible to those consumers? Well, that value then determines the price that I can charge, because the price is really up to consumers to decide whether they will pay the price or not. I can't force them, which leaves the cost to me. So I can only try to figure out the value and therefore the price of the good that I'm producing. And based off of that, I must make decisions on which costs to actually assume in the business. Can I afford a store in the heavily trafficked area, or do I need to sign a lease for a store in the outskirts of town where there are less customers, but where I can actually afford to pay the bill? So I will make those choices, but those choices are based on the cost. Uh, and that's my only choice variable, really, as an no. Now, of course, this means we have to define the terms too. What the heck is value? How can we understand value? Because if value is not price, and very often we think of the value of a good as simply in terms of its price. We say that, oh, is this shirt worth 100 euros? Well, then we mean, is the value of the shirt 100 euros, which is a simplification and a shortcut, but it's not really what we mean, because if the shirt is actually worth my 100 euros, it's actually valued higher than I value the 100 euros, or I wouldn't buy it. So there's something more to it, obviously. So simply put, value is the satisfaction, or the sort of the perceived well-being that you get from consuming a good. It is necessarily in the eye of the beholder. So the customer is always the person deciding what the value of a good is. The entrepreneur can't do that. The entrepreneur can't tell you the value of a good. They can only present to you the good and arguments, perhaps persuasive arguments, of how useful this thing is to you. But you, the customer, decides in the end whether it's valuable enough and why it is valuable to you. You may still make mistakes, but the decision is still yours. And and it is based on whatever personal experience you might have, the personal situation you're in, what you hope to get out of life, whatever it might be. So subjective is not really a term that means random or irrational or anything like that. Subjective just means it's personal, and it's our personal appreciation of something. And the recognition of value as subjective is a revolution in economics. And here's the founder of the Austrian school, Carl Mengel, who is one of the three economists who, at the same time, as they call it, within 4 years of each other, I think, in the 1870s, discovered not only that value is subjective, the value of a thing, and therefore the decision to act on buying or selling it is personal, but also that the thing itself is something that we value each and every unit individually. So This was the so-called marginalist revolution in economics, in which economists realized that, wait a minute, we don't value water itself, we value the next unit of water. And the next unit of water is valued based on our personal situation and our personal perception of what utility we might get out of this thing. So it's not actually the case that we value the thing itself. And this is what Menger says in 1871. Value is not inherent in goods. It's not the good itself that gives us value. It is independent of the good. It's really a judgment of how important that thing is for us in creating well-being. So if I were to use this thing, how well off would I feel? What is the satisfaction I get? And then from there, from that assessment, we can make a decision of, is it worth paying this much for it? So it all starts with value, and the value is not, it's the service that the thing gives to us and not the thing itself. And this is something that where the Austrians are probably the only ones who are consistent with applying subjective value. And it's also where we deviate most fundamentally, perhaps, with Marxists, for instance, who claim that there is objective value. Of course, if there's objective value, then in any trade, there's one winner and one loser. So because one person has understood the objective value of the thing, and the other has not, or they simply wouldn't choose to trade. Whereas for Austrians, it's obvious that no, we trade because we both expect to get something that we consider personally to be of greater value to us for whatever reason, but we trade for value, and we don't. And our valuations are always opposite to the one we're trading with. So we both are better off. So every trade, in a sense, is an improvement in our well-being, unless we are mistaken, of course. Okay, so this gives us a little bit of insight into goods. So what defines a good, an economic good, to Menger and to all Austrians afterwards, is that they have a direct relationship to satisfying our wants. But to produce a good takes time. So the whole point of engaging in production instead of consuming what is around us is that we can get something more out of it, but that means we're giving up the time it takes and the time we wait in order to until the good is available. So production, not only does it take time, but it also lessens the burden of scarcity. So we get more out of the world by producing if we can then also wait to consume. And we invest in all kinds of capital, which could be any type of tool or machinery or infrastructure or what have you, in order to increase our productivity, to get more goods out of the world, to get more exists. So production in itself is sort of it's an economizing and making ourselves more effective and efficient in producing the means to our own well-being. Now, the role of entrepreneurship in this is that it bears the uncertainty of production, which means that entrepreneurs invest in producing goods and services before we even know that they have any value. So they have the cost, but they don't know whether they will actually be rewarded or whether they will be able to sell what they're producing at a price that is higher than the cost that they already assumed to produce it. And that's the core of the uncertainty of that entrepreneurs bear in the economy. And the role of entrepreneurs is to make these investments, to speculate on what to produce in order to make life better for their customers. Okay, so entrepreneurship itself, then, it has to be consumer value oriented. If entrepreneurship is not focused on providing value to consumers, then they're completely acting blindly. They're not really directed to anything, because what determines whether a consumer is willing to pay the price necessary to cover the cost is the value they see in the product. So it's not really about the thing itself that you're producing. It's not really about the business either. It's about how you can make investments to serve the consumer to the best degree possible. And that's the problem that entrepreneurs are struggling with. And the problem, of course, is at the very core is the value of what you're producing. This is a huge problem, and this is a quote that I use a little now and then, for the simple reason that because consumers react to the product when they see it. It's only when you're in the store or you walk past the store and you see the thing and then the value for me to pay for it. It's not before then. It's not when someone starts designing a car uh, and in 10 years they're going to have the car ready. It's not when they start the design that the consumer says, oh yeah, that's a good idea. I'm going to pay for this. Because you're going to change your mind. You're going to have all kinds of different experiences between now and later. So usually consumers themselves don't know what will satisfy their wants until they see it, until it's already done. So Henry Ford supposedly said, and apparently this is not true, at least as far as we can tell, so it's not really a quote, but it's still great, that had I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Because in that situation, we're talking about like 1910 or something, people didn't have cars. When they transported themselves or things, they had horses and carriages. Hopefully, they strapped the horse in front of the carriage and not like economists, the carriage before the horse. But how could you improve their lives? Well, they would thought, well, I mean, I got the horse, I got the carriage, so maybe just faster horse, maybe a horse that doesn't poop as much, or a horse that is less moody, or doesn't eat as much hay, or whatever. But something that would improve their situation as it was for them. Ford, much like other entrepreneurs, thought, well, I think I can actually improve their lives even more by providing them with something they haven't even thought of. And this is something that successful entrepreneurs have discovered over and over again. Steve Jobs is known for saying that you can't engage in product design by focus groups because consumers don't know what a good product looks like until they see the product. So you can't ask them, so how should we produce the next type of phone? They have no clue. They don't know the engineering. They don't know what would be good for them. They wouldn't know how they would use it. So the entrepreneur will need to speculate on what is a good product in their situation. And great entrepreneurs do that, and they're able to sort of empathize with customers. But this means also then that what really drives the market is entrepreneurs attempting to create new value. It's not what already exists. It is what entrepreneurs imagine that they can produce for other people. Because entrepreneurs do these, they can also disrupt the government, and we can talk about this a little later. I'm going to sort of skip through it quickly here, but very often entrepreneurs produce products and change how people behave in such a way that it affects the effectiveness of government. So the regulations that exist no longer apply because entrepreneurs create a new type of world in a sense. So Uber is an example of that, where taxi businesses were heavily regulated in most of the world, whereas Uber offered a service that was basically the same, but claimed that it was not. So they sidestepped the regulations and thereby forced taxi companies to lobby government to remove regulations. So, which is sort of an interesting case. We can talk more about that later. Okay, so how is value created? Well, entrepreneurs do it in two different ways. They can improve the distribution of the goods that already exist by simply buying in markets where the price is low and selling in markets where the prices are high, or simply available to other people, or perhaps changing the product a little bit and improving it such that other people find it useful and therefore will buy it. And they can also increase through productive efforts the usefulness of goods, which includes creating new goods. And entrepreneurs sort of do both: new goods, better goods, and also expanding the distribution of those goods available. So both are, of course, of value to consumers. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the distribution of goods. That is, I already mentioned how entrepreneurs engage in arbitrage by buying in markets where the price is low and selling in markets where prices are high. This could happen through a supply chain and things like that, where, for instance, you might put some production in China and then sell in Europe or the United States because the prices of production or the cost of production in China are really low for whatever reason. and then the consumers are willing to pay a higher price in Europe and the US, and therefore there's a greater chance for profit for the entrepreneur. This, of course, also means that you're bidding up prices in China and you're bidding down prices of goods in Europe and the US. This also means that entrepreneurs then reallocate productive resources because they have to buy resources in order to produce goods in different markets, and they try to find where those resources are the cheapest, and they try to avoid the resources where they are the most expensive. And they also both succeed and fail. So when entrepreneurs succeed, they earn a profit and they can expand their business. When they fail, start another business for a while, and those resources are freed up for other entrepreneurs. Now, in terms of the usefulness of goods, which is something we think about more perhaps, and it's more exciting, which is the innovation of new types of goods and services, which create new value for consumers. That's the whole point of it, and that is what successful innovations do. They can improve the value of goods that already exist by tweaking them a little bit, perhaps, and they engage in trial and error. They try to figure out, is this the best way of pleasing these customers? If not, they pivot, as we call it. They try something different, or they try a different market, and so forth. So they try to figure out how to best serve consumers. Now this takes us back to the profit calculus for entrepreneurs. And I would claim that there are two types of profits that need to happen for an entrepreneurial endeavor to be successful. One, of course, is that the entrepreneur earns a profit, and that's the entrepreneur's money profit, which simply means that, well, that entrepreneur was able to keep the cost of production lower than the revenue of the goods and services sold. So they earn a profit. But in order to do so, the only reason an entrepreneur can do so in a market is by providing the consumer with a psychic profit. So the consumer sees this product, whatever it might be, figures that there's value in it, and based on that, they will decide whether to pay a price or not. The price is the cost for the consumer, but the cost for the consumer is really, what else could I have gotten for my money? So the consumer will buy if they get enough psychic profit out of buying this good over any other good, or keeping the money, or whatever the options are. So the entrepreneur is able to sell more the greater the psychic profit they offer to the consumer. So the higher the value, the lower the price. Obvious, perhaps, but still that offers the consumer greater profit, which makes it harder for the entrepreneur to make profit, but it makes it easier to sell. So it's not really the case, if you follow this, that an entrepreneur must price their goods at consumers' willingness to pay, as mainstream economists will have it, where you just maximize the price you can get out of the consumer, because that just makes selling so much harder. An Austrian will recognize that, no, if you offer enough profit for enough people, that consumers profit, then you're able to sell to them more easily, but that means you have to be even more focused on keeping the cost of production low. Okay, so what we have here then in this little roundabout discussion is, first of all, that value, it is subjective, and it's necessarily determined by consumers themselves. So an entrepreneur has basically zero power or even influence over value. That decision is completely made by the consumer. Of course, you can engage in persuasive measures and advertising and so forth, and try to make the consumer realize that there's value in this thing, but you can't determine the value for them. So the value is something that the consumer decides for him or herself, and it's can be very different for different people, of course. Now, the selling price, the price that the consumer chooses to pay for the good, is limited by, of course, their willingness to pay. But what that means also is that, well, you as an entrepreneur have an incentive to keep the price as low as possible to offer the consumer greater profit, which increases the likelihood that you can place a sale, and place a sale quickly. Of course, the lower from our experience as consumers, the lower the price of a good, the more it is a bargain. So if the price seems really low compared to the value that we get from the product, then wow, that's a that's so cheap. It doesn't really matter what the number says on the price tag. It could be 1,000 euros or it could be €1, depending on the good itself. It could be cheap or expensive. But the price is something that the entrepreneur needs to discover. What price are consumers willing to pay for it, and how willing are they? Which leaves, as I mentioned before, the cost of production, how to produce, how many to produce, what method to use, what materials to use, whether to use machines or people, all of these things. Those are variables that the entrepreneur can play with and try to figure out how to keep the cost as low as possible while maintaining high value of the product. But that's the only of these three that the entrepreneur can really change um, based on their own decision making. Regulations, finally. So what are regulations? Well, first of all, they are simply restrictions. So a regulation, they're usually dressed in other terms, and that people talk about on regulations as enhancing this and augmenting that and saving us from whatever. But the only thing that a regulation actually is a restriction imposed on action. So even if we want people to not do certain things, the regulation says you're not allowed to do these things because then we will impose a fine, or we will put you in jail, or we will take your business, or whatever it might be. So regulations, in the sense I'm using the term here, are imposed and they're enforced limits on what can be done, how it can be done, when it can be done, and who can do it. And it doesn't really matter in what market or what type of product. This is how regulations function, and all regulations are imposed in order to have an effect. So it's always the case that a regulation, of course, you can set minimum wage to 0, and then say that this is the law, this is a regulation, and we impose this. We're going to enforce this to the letter. Well, a minimum wage of 0 doesn't really have much of an effect on the economy at all. The whole point of a regulation is to change people's behavior. So the point of a regulation is to restrict. So it's not really very far-fetched to claim that they are restrictions, because they are. And the whole point is to restrict what people can and cannot do. And taxes are sort of a type of restriction which adds a financial burden on entrepreneurs in their actions as business people. Okay, so when there are regulations in place, then that still means that entrepreneurs make choices about how to deal with those regulations. It's not simply the case that, oh, shoot, there's a regulation, I'll just follow it and then that's it. No, they're still acting, and they're still considering different options. So what are the strategies with respect to regulations that entrepreneurs can choose from? Well, one is to simply abide, and that's the most common one. There's a law in place, so I'll just follow the law. Or I need a license to do this type of business, I'll get that license. Or I'm going to hire someone, the minimum wage is whatever, then I'm going to pay at least whatever. And that's the most common one. And the more entrepreneurs abide by a regulation, the more effective it is, of course, which is the whole point. But they can also evade it, which is what Uber did in the example, where they basically created a taxi service, but didn't call it a taxi service, and therefore said, well, taxi regulations, they do not apply to us because we're not a taxi business. And that's what entrepreneurs do when they consider regulations too burdensome, or when they see an opportunity in simply doing something in a different way, or avoiding or evading this restriction. They can also choose to alter, which is a more costly strategy, where the entrepreneur, him or herself, goes into politics by either lobbying or trying to get elected or what have you, in order to change the law and change the regulation, which of course changes the regulation for everyone and not only for that entrepreneur. So if it is too burdensome and makes it too hard, then the entrepreneur might just say, screw this, I'm going to close my shop, I'm going to do something else. Or I'm not going to start a business at all because it's just too costly, too burdensome, too much work because of the regulation. Now, all of these have negative impacts. So abiding by these regulations mean that you have increased cost, because you probably wouldn't choose to act in this way were it not for the regulation. And why would you not choose it? Well, because it's costlier. So that is increased cost. Evading regulations means that you act in the same way, and you also have the risk of getting caught. So that's increased cost. Altering, going into politics, is not what entrepreneurs do usually. So that's an increased cost. And by exiting, we get a reduced value from the economy overall, because there are simply fewer entrepreneurs, fewer businesses, less production. So regardless of what strategy an entrepreneur chooses with respect to regulations, there's still increased cost and reduced value. Okay, so what is the impact? Well, the impact of regulations is that the value produced falls, simply because the different options available, any effective restriction, any effective regulation limits the scope of what entrepreneurs can do. And because it has an impact, it has limited some entrepreneurs from doing what they otherwise would have done. And we already know that entrepreneurs make money and they make profits by serving consumers, which means they cannot serve consumers to the extent that they otherwise would have chosen. It also increases the cost of production, because their entrepreneurs chosen to produce the products, which of course then also means that they have to accept higher costs or less effective methods or what have you. So what does this mean then for consumers and the value to consumers overall? Well, the real cost from regulations is, first of all, that entrepreneurs cannot pursue the highest valued opportunities in the way they wanted to pursue them. So any regulation that has an effect on the economy necessarily steers entrepreneurs away from what they otherwise would have done. And they would have chosen the opportunity where they see greatest value to consumers, because that's where the highest profit is. Whether they're right or wrong doesn't really matter. But now they cannot pursue that. So this reduces value creation, and therefore it must reduce the service to consumers as well. When they then instead pursue lower valued opportunities, well, that's an investment too, which means they will invest in technologies that are not as good as they would have otherwise chosen. They will invest in producing products that are not as valuable as they would have chosen otherwise, and so forth. Well, these investments are demand on these things. They bid up prices and so forth. And these things are embedded into the production structure overall in the marketplace. So no longer is the economy pursuing the greatest consumer value, because, well, that's been regulated away. So other entrepreneurs choose differently. And because they choose differently, they cement this lesser value creative structure of the economy, which means leaves us at a lower level and puts us in a terrible situation, for the simple reason that entrepreneurs react on and improve on what exists. So if you recall that when the first iPhone was released, it was really an innovation based on the iPod, the music playing device, and the fact that there are phones and internet connectivity and stuff like that. So because there were iPods, Apple reacted on that and said, wait a minute, we can produce an even fancier, even greater gadget, a device with internet too, and phone service capability. But had there been a regulation in place that didn't allow them to produce the iPod to begin with, then we also wouldn't get the iPhone, because you can't just make that up out of thin air, which means that these investments in lesser valued opportunities are the basis for the next generation, if you will, or the next step in terms of innovation, which means that we are on a trajectory in terms of new value creation for the future based on a lower level on different technologies and so forth. Okay, so the difference between the two then, the difference between where we're actually at and the where the economy would have us without these restrictions or these regulations. That is what I refer to as the unrealized. So there is a different world where you didn't have all these crippling regulations, where entrepreneurs could much more freely choose how to serve consumers and do so in the ways they wanted to. That is the lowest cost ways or the most effective ways, whatever it might be. That world, but it's gone because of regulations. So the difference between where we are at today and that world is what is unrealized. That's the value, the prosperity, the well-being that we simply did not get. And this is what I talk about in my 2016 book, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, which is now available also in Spanish. Okay, so conclusions then. Regulations, all it takes is one regulation that affects entrepreneurial behavior, that forces them to produce different products or produce them in different ways or using different resources, will put us on a lower value created trajectory. So we will not create, they will not be able to create as much prosperity for us as otherwise would be the case. And then the next generation of entrepreneurs will act on that level and produce new value based off of that lower level, which will further cement this lower trajectory. It also means that all regulations are far more costly than anyone really understands. I mean, of course, there are assessments of the cost of regulations when politicians discuss how to implement this thing or that thing, or whether to choose this regulation or the other. There are economic analyses of how much will this cost. Well, the problem here is that they don't consider the unrealized. They look at the static world, they look at the statistics, and then based on the statistics, they make different predictions of where the economy would be, and then they compare the two. But they don't have entrepreneurship in their models. They don't have innovation in their models. They don't really understand the driving force in the economy. So they estimate the cost of regulations grossly. And that's why politicians and bureaucrats can, well, I mean, they exaggerate too, but they can sell regulations to us as basically free, or even saying that, well, this regulation will make the world better in whatever sense. And even if they use the analysis of economists to show how costly it is, because usually the opposing side will always say, well, how much does it cost? And they will point to the economists' analysis, and you'll say, well, it's not that costly because the social value of this, whatever it is so much higher. So this is a freebie. This is a positive sum regulation, because they fail to recognize the unrealized, and they do not have an entrepreneurial perspective. They don't understand the market as an actual market process. So this takes me to a meme that has been going around quite a bit, just contrasting the three powerhouses, or the economic powerhouses in the world. I wouldn't say it's perfectly accurate, but it's also not perfectly wrong. That much of the innovation that happens in the world happens in the United States, in the American economy. China is really good at copying stuff, and they don't give a damn about patents and things like that. So they copy, and they copy quickly, and they copy cheaply. Whereas Europe's greatest quality or contribution to the world economy is simply to regulate. And we see this, to use one recent example, with artificial intelligence, where most innovation in this space is based in the United States, and perhaps mostly in Silicon Valley, but that doesn't really matter. So you have all these different AI engines and the large language models and things like that, and they're innovated in the United States. China quickly caught up because they copy, and then they add their own stuff too, of course. So quickly created similar capabilities, I suppose. Whereas in Europe, I think there are basically zero AI companies in Europe, but there's plenty of regulation, so there simply cannot be an AI company or even an AI industry because there are regulations in place that make it impossible. And that's where we're at now. So the question, how can we make Europe more competitive? How can we help Europe create greater growth and be just as great as it can be? Well, it's pretty obvious. You can't regulate your way to prosperity. The only way to get to prosperity is to let entrepreneurs do their thing and let entrepreneurs serve consumers. And the only way of doing that is to simply get out of their way and allow them to benefit um, from clearly formulated and enforced property rights, like Annette mentioned in the beginning. So property rights that are not random or arbitrary, but they're actually enforced in their rights, and then allow entrepreneurs to both fail and succeed and try stuff out, try to figure out serve consumers. And that's the only way of creating and maintaining prosperity. And Europe there is going in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Well, all of these three are going in the wrong direction, don't get me wrong. But Europe is definitely excelling in terms of regulating the heck out of the economy. And that's not a good thing. All right, I'll be happy to take your questions. I'll